measuring program in place, because not only do we do the metrics analysis, but we deliver the metrics analysis and say, going forward, you should try to measure your success or failure this way. So, there are a number of angles you could use in this, reading books and or thinking through the process that I just outlined, or having us come in and do an assessment for you. There are a number of different ways to get that off the ground. Let's see. Another question here related to metrics, and this is a good one. This is via email. We've been through some nasty metrics efforts where managers used metrics to reward and punish people. What can we do about that? The important thing to keep in mind, I think, is that 90% of the time, a metric is measuring a process. It's not measuring individual behavior. Now, going back to Deming, and I know that, Lee, if you're still out there, you will even admit that this is Deming, the famous red bead, black bead experiment that he did. I don't want to try to go through and describe that all now in just a few minutes, because I won't do it justice. But if you do a quick web search about the red bead, black bead experiment, do that. Read up on it if you've never heard about it. It's a demonstration of the fact that even though process is typically defined by management, and thus the process capability is defined by management, there is a tendency to want to hold individuals responsible for the outcome of the process capability, and that's this is a problem. This is the scapegoating thing. So in most organizations, managers define the process, and if the metrics are showing below target process performance, and the place to look is at the process, not at the people. So this tendency to get into what's sometimes jokingly referred to as blame storming to figure out who to scapegoat is certainly just totally counterproductive, because what you're dealing with is a process problem. And it's like, if somebody's driving a car and the motor is dying, yelling at the driver of the car about why the car is going slowly, and you're having a mechanical failure of the motor that's nothing to do with the driver. This is not going to be helpful, and in fact, it distracts the driver from their ability to deal with a suboptimal situation and probably makes it worse. Now, that said, this is a very common problem. I wrote an article on this a few years ago called "No More Bad MBOs," and it was about metrics-based yearly performance evaluation process, which is called management by objectives. That's what MBO stands for. And we've seen this go very badly for a number of clients. So you might want to take a look at that article. And again, it's on the rvcs-us.com website on the library page. We got a question from Sergey here. Can you tell about the quantitative size of a successful test team? Do you have a link between the number of members of test team and type of project? Okay, so this is a test estimation, and we always get nervous when we see clients that are relying on the tester to developer ratios that they plucked off the internet to determine what the number of testers ought to be. Now, I think it's definitely true, as Sergey says, that there tends to be a correlation between type of project and the number of members of the test team. And if you've got if you're dealing with something that's safety critical, then obviously you can have a lot more. I mean, the old IBM team, a number of years ago, was involved in testing space shuttle software. During the development of that software, there were 10 testers for every programmer, which you would hope so. And notice that of the problems that have happened with the space shuttle, there have not been any that I know of, any serious failures that are associated with software. So that was indeed an effective way of getting bugs out of the software. but it's very expensive. And at the other end of the scale, we see people, that have more like 5 developers to every tester, or 3 developers to every tester, and so forth. My usual rule of thumb is that anything less than 1 tester for every 10 developers you're probably dealing with window dressing. That there's just going to be no time for the tester to do anything but run around and try to put out fires, and it's not going to be very effective. Excuse me. Now, there are some models for this. I mean, if you go out to look at some books like, say, the TMAP book, I'm not sure if it's in the new edition of the TMAP book. It's certainly in the older edition of the TMAP book. The previous one was called Software Testing, A Guide to the TMAP Approach. That included a model called test point analysis in it, which is like at the total other end of the scale from the tester to developer ratio, or the tester to developer ratio. You're trying to do something really simple and quantitative, and a TPA, test point analysis, is extremely complicated, a lot of different factors and so forth. And the thing with that model is, I think if you look at it and think about it enough, you'll realize, wow, I really have to tune this very carefully to get this to come up with the right answers. So, in our assessments, we really haven't found a whole lot of good substitutes on project testing to the classic work breakdown structure that is populated and sized based on some combination of historical metrics from previous projects, along with the input from the various people who are participating in the estimation process. So, this mix of individual efforts or individual expertise and metrics, I think, is good. And another thing that I think is important is to remember that any estimate is almost always going to involve some amount of negotiation. So just because you're able to come up with an estimate and you say, yeah, we can do this, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are going to look at that, management's going to look at that and say, hey, this is great, go ahead and do that. I mean, usually there's going to be some pushback. Management's going to come back and say, hey, understand that this is how long you want, but the project has to be done by this date, so you got to have testing done by this date, and so we need you to cut off 25% of your test execution schedule, but by the way, we can't give you any more money, and in fact, we can't even give you as much money as you asked for. And so there's always going to be some element of iteration and negotiation here. So don't see that necessarily as a failure. There's always some amount of adjustment about how much testing you would like to do versus how much testing the organization is actually going to enable you to do. Okay, we got a question from Letitia here. Rex, do you use a framework or a maturity model to perform a test assessment? That's a good question. So I wrote a book called Critical Testing Processes, which is the framework that I use to do the assessment, combined with some metrics analysis that I've grown up over the years. But I mean, most of what we look at is described in that book, Critical Testing Processes. So that's a framework that's out there. Maturity models. Sometimes clients say, well, as part of doing this, we'd like you to look at our TMM/TMMI maturity or TPI maturity and so forth. And we can do that as well. I would point out that one of the things that I think makes maturity models somewhat problematic at this point for testing is, I think if you contrast TPI versus TMMI, they're both prescriptive in the sense that they tell you the order in which you're supposed to improve particular processes, but they give you a different order. So clearly there's no uniform consensus across the testing experts about what order things ought to be improved in. And I actually think that it's not possible to have a uniform consensus about that, because testing, it very much has to be, as I said at the outset of this, connected to business value. And so ultimately, improving testing has to be connected to business value. So we're really big on